Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping into a fascinating legal case from the 1950s. Now, on the surface, it looks pretty simple, but it actually put the brand new United Nations head-to-head with a really stubborn member state. And believe it or not, the fate of an entire territory was hanging in the balance.
Okay, so let's get into our first section, a strange question. And it really was a strange one, especially when you hear it today.
So get this. On December 3rd, 1955, the UN General Assembly, the whole thing, asked the world's highest court this question. And if you cut through all that legal jargon, what they're really asking is, hey, is it okay for our committee to let people talk? Can we let them come and speak their complaints out loud instead of just writing them down on paper? I know what you're thinking. That seems like an obvious yes, right? But the very fact that the UN had to go to the world's highest court just to get permission to listen to people, well, that tells you there's a much bigger story going on here. It's a story about a defiant nation, a really old set of rules, and a whole new global order trying to figure out its place in the world. That brings us to Section 2, the uncooperative caretaker. To really get to the heart of this whole thing, we've got to talk about a territory called Southwest Africa, what we know today as Namibia, and the country that was supposed to be looking after it. You see, after World War I, the League of Nations set up something called the mandate system. The whole idea was that certain advanced nations would govern these territories as a sacred trust of civilization, supposedly, guiding them until they could govern themselves. The mandate for Southwest Africa, it was given to its next-door neighbor, South Africa. But, and this is a big but, after World War II, the United Nations took over for the old League of Nations, and when the UN tried to exercise its supervisory duties, it just hit a brick wall. South Africa, the country in charge, just flat out refused to cooperate. They stopped sending in their annual reports, and they wouldn't even pass along the written complaints from the people living in Southwest Africa.
So, let's move on to Section 3, a rule from the past, because South Africa's refusal to play ball created this huge legal headache, and it forced the UN to go digging through the rulebook of an organization that didn't even exist anymore.
Turns out, a previous court opinion had said the UN should supervise the territory by following the old League of Nations procedure as far as possible. And those four little words, as far as possible, well, they became the legal battleground for this entire case. And here's where it gets really interesting. The old League of Nations, well, it looked at written petitions, sure, but there was one thing it had never, ever done. It had never once granted an oral hearing. So for anyone opposing the UN, this was the smoking gun. You see the argument, right? If the League never did it, how could the UN, if its instructions were to follow the old rules as far as possible?
Which brings us to Section 4, the court's clever answer. So you have this standoff. South Africa is giving them nothing, zero information, and the UN feels like its hands are tied by these old dusty rules. So how did the court solve this? Well, it was pretty clever.
First off, you have to understand, this was a huge deal. This wasn't some minor debate happening in a back room. The court got official statements from major world powers, like the United States and the United Kingdom. Basically, the whole world was watching to see what would happen.
And it wasn't just the old powers either. You had newly independent nations like Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, making sure their voices were heard too. For them, this case was a massive test. Was this new UN actually going to hold nations accountable? Or was it just going to be stuck following the traditions of the old colonial world? The court's reasoning was just brilliant. First, they said, look, what's the number one goal here? It's effective international supervision to protect that sacred trust. Then they looked at that tricky phrase, as far as possible, and said, you know what? This is meant to be flexible. It's not a straitjacket. And third, and this is the kicker, they argued that because South Africa was stonewalling them, oral hearings weren't just some new procedure, they were now an absolutely necessary tool for the UN to do its job.
So the bottom line was a conditional yes. The court said oral hearings were okay, provided the General Assembly decided they were necessary for effective supervision. They didn't just give a simple answer. They basically handed the power to adapt right back to the General Assembly. It was a huge vote of confidence.
Okay, last section. Section 5, why the verdict mattered. Because this decision, which came down on June 1st, 1956, was about so much more than just a single procedural rule. Its impact was felt far and wide. And it wasn't a slam dunk. The decision was actually really close, 8-5. The 5 judges who disagreed even wrote a joint opinion to explain why.
And that just goes to show you, this was not an easy call. It was a seriously contentious and complicated legal question.
So, what's the big takeaway here? Well, first, it confirmed the UN's power to adapt, to change its methods to get the job done, even when a country was actively trying to stop it. It was a victory for the spirit of the law over just blindly following old rules. But maybe most importantly, it finally opened a door for the people in these territories to have their voices heard on the world stage.
You know, this whole case leaves us with a question that's just as relevant today as it was in 1956. When do the rules of the past stop being helpful and start becoming a barrier to justice? And how do we know when it's time to adapt, to make sure the core mission of our institutions isn't crushed by their own procedures? Something to think about.